In our podcast, Hearing the Unheard Stories of Transformation, we discuss a variety of sensitive subjects such as suicide, suicidal ideation, self harm, abuse, and faith crisis. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to our podcast, Hearing the Unheard Stories of Transformation, presented by Pause Wellness. I'm your host, Eric Stoffer, and my guest today, once again, is Jill Dickey. Hi, Jill.
Hi, Eric. I'm starting to get comfortable in this chair staring at you
I
on the
know.
screen. Yeah.
It's it just takes a little bit of practice, and then you start feeling familiar with the process.
Yeah. It's getting like more routine. But I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion today as a follow-up to our part one in this three-part series around building a solid sense of self.
So, sense of self, part one. Why don't we review that? Can you review that for us real
Yeah.
quick?
So in part one, okay, so just for those who are just barely tuning in, and this is maybe your first episode that you've listened to, I would recommend going back and listening to our first podcast. It wasn't our first one, our second podcast on differentiation, because we are looking at the four skills or the four parts of building, or not building, but like learning differentiation and what that means and what it looks like. And the first skill or the first developmental aspect of differentiation is sense of self. So we're breaking that down, and we chose to do 3 episodes because there's so much to this. And so our first episode we talked about, okay, so we talked about what I think we defined sense of self, and if you want me to read that definition, I can. But we also talked about how it's a lifelong journey and that it takes self-reflection and intentional action to build a sense of self. And so today we're going to talk about a big aspect of knowing yourself that I think is really core and important to solid sense of self.
Yeah,
Is
that's
there
great.
anything you want me to add to that?
No, I think that's great. So, in summary, we're going through differentiation. First step in differentiation is sense of self, and we're doing 3 parts on sense of self. Today will be part two.
Yes, they will be part two. And so what I'm going to do, Eric, is okay, I think what else I didn't mention was that last time we talked about reflected sense of self and earlier stages of development, how we outsource a sense of self. We talked about all those A words.
Mhm.
And then we also talked about distortions of sense of self, being one up, and trying to organize a sense of self by feeling superior to people. And then one being one down, just kind of occupying that I'm never as good as or good enough. That's also a distortion of reality around sense of self. And so we're going to kind of incorporate some of that into what we're talking about today, but we're going to talk about a different aspect of it. And so I want to remind you of I remember in our last recording for part one of this series, you were waxing very philosophical at the first of the episode.
As
And
one does.
yes, you started talking a bit about what we would say in like psychoanalytic terms, the persona, or like the face you put forward in your life that you think will be acceptable to people versus the things that you keep hidden because you think they won't be acceptable. And if you remember our discussion about differentiation, we talked about these two human needs that are very big and very important. The first one is connection. We need connection. It's a survival reality. So it's no joke. And we have this whole attachment system in us. And so connection is really important to us. And so we're going to develop ourselves in earlier stages of development to fit in, to belong. And that's where we kind of build this persona of, I think this is what people will find acceptable and what they won't in my particular context, in my culture, in my world.
Mhm.
And then we kind of decide the things that we need to hide. Do
Mhm.
you remember talking about that?
Yep.
Okay. And so this is something that I end up talking to clients about quite a bit in therapy. And in order to kind of help them understand this phenomenon of persona and hidden parts, I show them, and I'm going to show you. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see, but I show them a disco ball. This is just a little mini version of it. And I kind of point out that all these little mirrors, reflected mirrors, are like different aspects of the self, and there's quite a few, if you can see on here, quite a few. And again, there's parts of us that we think will be acceptable and we put them forward, and parts that we hide because we think they'll be unacceptable. Okay. And so today we're going to talk about the the phenomenon that building a sense of self is not just integrating and owning the good parts of us that are acceptable, but also getting to know and understand the parts we've put away, or the parts that are kind of hidden to ourselves that we need to get to know and integrate into us. And
So let me
yeah.
ask you a question on that. So we're not talking about public persona. We're just talking about, see, so for instance, if you're involved in a community, if you're deeply involved in a community, um, you have public self and then you have private self. And I'm not talking about hypocrisy. I'm just talking about, hey, these things, there are some things of my life that are private. There are some things that I'm okay with being public.
Mhm.
So you're not talking about public versus private. You're talking about um, having a persona and being true to yourself, even the parts you don't love about yourself.
More of that. And that's a really good question. I'm just trying to think of how to like elaborate on that a little bit more. I mean, part of what we keep hidden or think aren't, wow, that's deep. Um, there are just certain things that like publicly, these things are acceptable. And so we're going to be like pro-social when we're out and
Right.
about, you know? And then, yeah,
Hmm.
there may be parts of us that are more acceptable in our private lives. And they're just things we're not going to talk about at church or at school or,
Right.
at work. But we can be more like that at home. And these are all acceptable things, right? But there
Right.
are things that could be acceptable publicly, but we still hide, or things that could be acceptable privately and we still hide. And it could be what we keep away from others, or what we even keep away from our own acknowledgement or our own consciousness.
Mhm.
Did that clarify, or did I just confuse you more?
Yeah, no, I think that's totally fine. The public persona is where I get a little confused because some things are acceptable in some public's eyes and some things are not acceptable in other public eyes, right? So
Mhm.
it just depends on the communities that you belong to and
And some of
widely
that's just good
accepted
social
norms.
navigation.
Right.
Okay. So, we did this exercise once with friends when I was in grad school, and we got paper masks. And on the outside, we painted and decorated the mask for things that we feel are okay for people to see. What we put forward that we think are okay and acceptable for people to see. And then on the flip side of the mask, we did things that we know about ourselves that we don't think are okay for
Right.
people to see,
Hmm.
so that kind of gives a little bit more of a, but there are even things in the shadow, and I'll talk more about what that is, that we don't even acknowledge to ourselves, that sometimes we
Hmm.
have to go a little, we got to go digging and find
Are you
to help
talking
us.
about deviance or are you talking about just
Maybe,
personal
maybe,
shame?
maybe. So let's talk about the shadow, and maybe it'll start to be more
Okay.
clear. Okay. So for instance, you mentioned in our last podcast that you did this exercise with students where you asked them to write down something that they like about themselves and they
Hmm.
squirm, and you talked about how you have them write down something they don't like about themselves and they squirm.
Right.
And I really registered with that because I see that quite often as well. I'd say to a client, tell me something you really like about yourself. Oh, I don't know. Either they don't really know, or they just feel like it's prideful or arrogant to say something they
It's
like.
taboo to say
Yeah,
something
it's
nice
taboo
about
to say
yourself.
something you really like about
Looks
yourself.
prideful.
Yeah, and then, oh yeah, it's embarrassing to say things you don't like about yourself, or that kind of a thing. And so people squirm, and so um yeah, that I get that. I understand that human squirming that we do around both of those
Right.
things. So doing building a core sense of self, you got to know and develop positive aspects of yourself. You got to know and develop those positive things and be willing to own them. Okay. And, people in the one up, we talked about that one up, organizing a sense of self by feeling superior. People in the one up tend to um, overvalue positive aspects of themselves and undervalue negative aspects of themselves. That
Is
seems to
that
be a
like
tendency.
narcissism?
Oh, in the extreme, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you go real extreme on the end of the spectrum, that's what you'd find, right?
Okay.
And then, we also need to know and improve negative aspects of ourselves. And so people who are in the one down tend to be undervaluing of positive aspects of themselves and overvaluing of the negative.
Hmm. Pessimistic,
Yeah, just very self, what's the word?
degrading.
That's right. I don't know why that was a hard word for me to come up with, but it was. So thanks for that. So finding a balance of doing this, looking at knowing and learning about the positive and exploring that and enhancing those things, and also looking at the negative aspects of yourself and working on those things, finding a balance is key to this core sense of self. Any comments there?
I just am stuck on the word degrading, as I think I could have said degrading.
Great.
It's probably
Either
the
one.
right word,
I
right?
think they both kind of get the point
See,
across.
I'm willing to admit when I have flaws in my vocabulary.
It's true. It's true. Okay, so are you familiar with Carl Jung?
Yes,
I
not
think I'm
really
saying that right.
familiar, but I remember reading some of his studies in my undergrad.
Okay, he's kind of the person who brought this idea of the shadow self to light. So we're going to talk about that. He was a Swiss psychiatrist and he coined this term the shadow self. And his definition of it in really a quick phrase is the things we have no wish to be, the aspects of ourself that we have no wish to be for some reason or another. Okay. So to be more, again, it's totally understandable why you want to keep negative aspects of ourselves in the dark. But Jung believed that we couldn't become our whole selves unless we brought light to the shadow.
So meaning exposing what's in the shadow or improving the shadow with more light, or is it
Mm,
both?
exposing it either places where it needs to be aired out and talked about, parts that we need to just like recognize and integrate. There's lots of ways you could bring light to it. But we need to take what's in the shadow and bring it out and shine a light on it so we can integrate it. And we'll talk more about what that's like.
Okay.
All right. And it's a big part of this differentiation process. If you look up the definition of the word integrate, okay, it's the process of forming or uniting parts into a larger unit, making something whole.
So it's like integrity,
Hmm.
the
Yep.
whole self,
Right. You got
not
it.
not hypocritical, not
Yes,
two-faced.
exactly. That's one way to describe it. So let's pull apart a little bit more kind of things that are in the shadow. And I'm not going to do this perfectly because there's a lot, but let's try and see if we can define a little bit more what could
We're in
be in the
luck. I don't
shadow.
have a whole lot in my shadow, so it's okay. It's
Well,
not a whole
let
lot
me
to
read this list and you can tell me if that's true, if you still think
Okay,
that's true at the end of it. Okay.
sounds good.
The shadow is comprised of material that we've chosen to push down or not acknowledge, right? There's a poet, his name's Robert Bly, and he was talking about the shadow. I think the visual that he created in his writing about it, he called it the long bag we drag behind us. That's all this material that it's
Great
kind of
way.
heavy,
That's
but we don't want to.
imagery is great.
Yes, it's a good one. So some of the things that could be in that long bag that we're dragging behind us could be hidden desires, suppressed emotions, unowned parts of ourselves. And to even get more specific, it could be things we've experienced that we haven't processed or dealt with. So maybe trauma,
Mhm.
things like that, or things that are unexperienced that we haven't allowed ourselves to experience for some reason that we need to experience. Like, for instance, a negative emotion, something like that. Another way you can think about it is morally problematic parts of us.
Mhm.
Another way that you could think about it isn't necessarily morally problematic parts per se, but things that we're embarrassed about. if we grew up in a culture where these certain things weren't acceptable, but they really are a part of who we are. And we
Right.
haven't been able to bring it forward or talk about it or share it or even acknowledge that it's there. Okay, that's the best I can do about
Yeah.
some like easier ways to understand what kinds of things could be in the shadow. So what comes to mind for you? And then I want to talk about a different part of the shadow that could be part of this too.
Yeah, I think certain memories for sure. Like, I know in my personal life, I think that like stuff from when I was pretty young, I will look back on myself and hold myself accountable. The phrase is presentism. Not sure if you're familiar with that phrase, but presentism is when we have a tendency to hold a previous either decade or culture or something to our current standard.
Hmm.
So I oftentimes, with my level of knowledge and development and education, will hold my former self to the standard of my current
Hmm.
understanding, which
Hmm.
is not very fair, especially to the youngest form of myself.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, a lot of the youngest form of myself were some of my biggest traumas in life.
Hmm.
Um, I remember when I was working with my therapist on some of these things, he was talking to me about um, rabbit holes, like our brain, the darkness is this. We assume it's this really deep rabbit hole that goes on forever, and if we fall in it, we'll never,
Come
well,
out.
yeah, we'll never come out.
Hmm.
And he said that as he explored his own, um, he giggled because he couldn't believe how shallow it was
Mm.
because he had left it so scary and so deep and so dark.
That when he
But
crawled in, he
when
realized it wasn't as deep as he thought,
it
and he could
wasn't as,
really
yeah, it
just look
wasn't
at it.
as deep.
Yeah. I see that all the time. Like people are like, oh, that wasn't so scary to acknowledge. And I don't want people to get the wrong idea that I think you should take all of your deepest, darkest secrets and go tell everybody about it.
Right. No. In an
There are just things that
appropriate,
aren't appropriate to tell everyone. But if you're
right.
not even acknowledging it to yourself or it's unprocessed, maybe therapy is a really good place to go do that because there's
Yeah.
safety there to kind of disclose deep things in a confidential setting.
Yeah. That's why I love therapy and therapists so much is because of that. It is that place where you can do that in a safe way. And then obviously very healthy, trusting relationships
Hmm.
where when we are loved and people love us and they are trustworthy and then they know these shadows of ourselves
Yeah,
and yet they reflect the love that we're afraid we don't deserve.
right. You're talking about true intimacy, to know and be known for who you really
Yes.
are. And that's what becoming a differentiated self, that's the outcome of all this work that we're talking about, is so that you can truly be intimate and close and connected to other people because you know who you are, both the light and the dark, right?
Yes.
And you're
Yeah.
comfortable enough to know another person, both the light and the dark. It's a really beautiful thing that we're trying to help people see. And there's just a lot of material to it,
Yeah,
right?
so I would say like for me, the shadows, the people in my life who know of my shadows or
Hmm.
my shadow selves are parents, siblings, um, obviously my wife. My wife is the number one by
Hmm.
far knows the most.
Hmm.
And priest, I was going to say priesthood leaders, but to use a more universal language, religious leaders.
Like a clergy that
Yeah,
you trust,
clergy. And then of course,
maybe good friends.
yep, some good, yep, good friends and a therapist or
Yeah.
multiple therapists.
A lot of
So
people
those have all
say
been
they're,
people who are so like it's a terrible phrase to use, but like take a bullet for kind of people.
Mhm.
I just my love and my respect and my appreciation for them is it runs as deep as anything.
Yes, and hopefully people are lucky enough to have those kinds of relationships. Not
Yeah,
everybody has parents who are safe to talk to.
right.
Not everyone has created safety in their marriage or been able to have safety in their marriage. So it behooves people to try to find out, where can I go where I can find help and support. And for some people, it may just be a professional therapist.
Yep. That might be their only
It really
option.
might be. And then maybe they can help you in ways that can help you find other safe people in your life, because
Yeah.
that can be tricky for a lot of people to find in their lives. And someone defined therapy once to me in such an interesting way. They said it's uncommon conversations,
Hmm.
mostly being able to have uncommon conversations. And I think part of that is this shadow work that we're talking about. Can I talk about another aspect of the shadow that I think is interesting?
Yeah.
Jung said that we have another kind of part of us that's not quite deep into the shadow called the golden shadow. And he said these are healthy parts of us that have been unexperienced.
Hmm.
So, for instance, I have a good friend who grew up with a really kind of abusive, demanding father. And the only two acceptable professions that his sons could be were doctors and lawyers, even if that's not what they wanted to do, if that wasn't what they really truly wanted and yearned to be. But in order to keep safe with him, they had to pursue those careers. And so my friend became a doctor. And he hasn't hated the profession, but it hasn't really been true to his deeper self, his core
Hmm.
self. And so, in order to become healthier and more integrated, he's had to look at these unexplored, healthy parts of himself. What he really wanted to become was an architect. And he was also
Hmm.
really interested in teaching. And so he's been looking at these aspects of himself and finding ways that he can integrate these creative parts of himself that got ignored because he was trying to keep his father happy with him. So that can be something that's part of this shadow work too, is finding these beautiful, healthy parts that haven't been able to come out and flourish.
Hmm.
So that's one way to think about it too. So I think it would be good, Eric, if we kind of talked about some examples, more examples, because this can be kind of it's deep stuff. So I think examples help people understand. And one of them that I thought about was, okay, let's talk about somebody who needs to do some integration work. All right. And I'm thinking of
Okay.
someone who maybe has a mean streak, who
Mm.
tends to bully other people. And oftentimes, with people who are like this, deep down in their shadow are feelings of fear and vulnerability and hurt parts of themselves that haven't been acknowledged or integrated or worked through. And so when they see other people who are vulnerable or fearful or hurting, they'll attack. They'll go on the attack. And what they're doing is kind of attacking parts of themselves that they haven't integrated.
It's such an interesting thing because bullying, the counterintuitiveness of bullying, to me, there's two. One is they come across as confident and not
Mm-hmm.
needing
Mm-hmm.
compassion and kindness because they're confident enough that they can be jerks to someone else, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's counterintuitive. And then the second is that they if it's actually an expression of their insecurity.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
So
overconfidence can be a defense against the shadow, right?
that's right.
Those hurt parts. And sometimes that comes out in bullying behavior.
Yeah, so
And not just in
if I was
kids
ever
in
bullied,
school.
I never wanted to have compassion for someone who was unkind to me and
Mm-hmm.
bullying me.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, if I was really compassionate, they were the ones that needed compassion.
Yeah, and it doesn't make bullying a good
It's
choice
not.
or something
That's
good to
right.
do, and it needs to be dealt with, but you can think of this person that needs to be unkind and attacking as someone who hasn't, they're hurting somewhere
Yep.
inside. Another one, I wanted to use an example of my own. Okay. I I have a strong propensity towards orderliness and cleanliness.
Where did you get that?
Can't imagine. Can't imagine where. Hey,
Is
mom,
it
wherever you
genetic?
are. Yeah.
Is it nurture? What is it?
Could
Could be
be.
both.
Well, I mean, I think it is my temperament too, and it was also
Sure.
partly my nurture, but and it's not all bad to be orderly, but sometimes that can be over the top for me.
Yep.
And I think maybe what that could be covering up is my fear of chaos or my fear of lack of control.
Is it a fear? Okay, fear of your own chaos and fear of your own lack of control.
Both,
But is it fear of what others might think of your lack of control or your disorder?
both. I think so.
Uh,
Yeah. And the way that it manifests in me is that I'm like kind of obsessively orderly.
mhm.
And I get kind of upset when people in my environment don't do it for me.
And they don't want it the same
Yeah.
way as you.
Yes. And so if I want to be more healthy around that with the people that I care about, I've got to look at what I'm afraid of, that I have to keep everything perfectly organized in my environment.
Mhm.
And it doesn't mean I have to stop being organized. It might help me stop being upset with the people who are messing with that. And
You
maybe
know,
I can
it
let
didn't,
some things go when I need to let some things go.
yeah, it didn't take me very long into marriage, you know, coming from those same tendencies for my own life to have order and structure and those kinds of things, that I knew that this compulsion of mine it was just gonna bowl over my wife.
Hmm.
Um, Not that she's messy or disorderly, just life, you know, having young kids and those kinds of things. And I had such strong opinions on this. I could see that every time I expressed them, it was hurting her.
Hmm.
And I just thought to myself, do I really care about this that much? That I, you know, not that again, not that order isn't great, and again, not that Emily isn't doesn't have her own
But is it
desire
worth
for,
the price I'm paying?
yeah,
Yeah.
is it worth to hurt this person I love so dearly
Hmm.
to have this order?
Well, and my guess is that, if we got you in a counseling room together, there might be a little bit of her shadow in there too that could be looked at,
For sure.
right?
Yeah, no question
Right.
about that. Is
So can I mention another one that
yeah.
you mentioned in, I think, our podcast on perfectionism? I think it was our first one. I have a
Hmm.
brain like a steel trap, Eric. I got your number.
You should be. You're a therapist.
So you mentioned this need for affirmation that you have in your teaching, your career, right? And that's one that I think a lot of people can relate to. And there might be some shadow there to look at. If I'm not getting affirmation and acknowledgement, what's why is that upsetting and difficult for me?
Mhm.
And why am I seeking that so much? There might be something under there to
Yeah,
look at.
I would say that there's I, the funny thing of my hesitating to respond to this is, so I would say that I get acclimated to certain levels of praise or certain levels of, you know, positive response. And if there's if there isn't that level coming, then I assume there's something wrong.
Yeah, there you go.
I would always I'd always say this. Anytime I had student evaluations, I could have 99.9% of students saying something really, really positive and really, really good. But if one of them is saying something critical, I disregard the other 99%.
Mm,
And I'm just so hyper focused on that critical feedback. And I think I either feel animosity towards someone feeling that way, even though they were probably just being very honest. In fact, maybe the only honest ones. And and then I get hyper focused on not even recognizing the positives that were there.
sure.
So
And
it's out of balance.
people aren't lovers of criticism. I mean,
Right.
maybe really healthy people are. And so that, there's that. That's kind of, it's normal, but it could help you to be looking and see if there's some parts that need talking and integration and thinking about and reflecting on around that.
You know, and it's
You
pretty
know?
crazy because why did I get into a profession where feedback is constantly given?
Hmm.
And I knew early on, okay, there's going to be student evaluations all my career. I'm going to have administrators that are coming into my classrooms. They're going to be evaluating me. And so I actually developed a routine of how to make this easier for me. And that was, I'm going to beat them to the punch. So before they can give me critical feedback, I'm going to tell them, hey, this is something that I'm working on. Will you please look for this in as you're watching?
Yeah.
And then as they're about to give their feedback, I would try to beat them to that. I would say, man, I really didn't do very well at this. or I didn't do really very
I'm
well
just
at this.
letting you know I'm already aware.
That's right. Like I don't need you to point this out to me. I know this of myself already.
Mm,
I don't know. Those are some of the coping mechanisms I've used with that. But
just something to think about. I like the
yeah,
honesty there. Okay. All right. So the next thing is like, what happens when we keep the shadow at bay and we don't ever go there? I
well,
think,
I think I to me, just in quick response, it gets darker and scarier.
yeah, kind of like that rabbit hole analogy that the longer
Yep.
you avoid looking, the more scary it feels to go in.
Yep.
And what I've seen in therapy work is that it's actually as painful as it can be to crawl into the rabbit hole. It's also highly relief, like a lot of relief for people and freedom when they just acknowledge these things that they're using so much energy to keep away.
Yes, yes, yes,
Yes.
yes. I used
But
to
I
watch
think,
all these TV shows where a main character would tell a lie and then they'd put a lie on top of a
yeah.
lie and then it would illustrate how when this all comes unraveled, it's going to be terrible. When if they would have
Mhm.
just been honest in the first place, they wouldn't have all of these other lies to have to keep up.
Eric, that's such a good, I had a really good week working last week. And part of the reason is because I had two clients that I've been working with for a really long time to gently guide them into their shadow and help them see the deception, self-deception, and other deception that they're participating in that's really hindering their ability to be peaceful and to be happy and to be free and to be healthy in their relationships, which is why they came to me. And we've been working for a long time because it can be difficult for people to look at this, especially when they've had difficult childhoods and upbringings where a lot of these defenses are there that have kept them safe in younger stages of their life. And they came in, and I just have the deepest respect for these people who come in and I finally seen this in myself. And I had one guy, I just respect him so much. He's just the coolest guy. And he's only 24 years old. He used to be an addict, substance addict. He grew up with a drug addicted mother and an abusive father, and he became a teenage dad, and he's just really trying to improve his relationship with his wife. And he came in and he finally said, hey, I've been lying to myself and lying to my wife, and I just was praying about it there. He's not really religious, but he just decided he couldn't live with this anymore. And he he started to confess the things that he'd been lying about for so long to his wife and to his best friends who he was terrified to tell. And to me, when he had to come in and tell me, I've been lying and I've been denying it to you and to my wife in this room. And it was just a beautiful session. It was just so beautiful. And I said, well, how do you feel now that you've acknowledged all that? And he goes, I feel free. I feel, I'm going to get emotional. He just said, I feel peaceful for the first time in decades. It was just beautiful. And that's someone who went towards that scary shadow and faced it. And the rewards were so beautiful
That
because
reminds me.
let me say one
Sorry,
more
go
thing
ahead.
before without that, he's internally divided. He's at war with himself, and his energy is being used to stuff down those self-deceptions and other deceptions and lies and things that he doesn't want to acknowledge instead of being used toward, integration and then being able to create in his life because so much energy was being used to keep it all down. And he was experiencing, that self-deception and anger and a lot of shame that he didn't want to acknowledge. And even and his addictions, he said a lot of my addictions were about not wanting to acknowledge this dishonest part of me, and it's just like all of these things were going away as he was becoming more integrated and honest. It was just, that's my favorite thing to work with people around in therapy.
That reminds me. What I was going to say is it reminds me of that moment in Dear Evan Hansen, the
Oh yeah.
musical,
Uh-huh.
where he's had all those lies and his shadow, it would, his own suicidal ideation. And then he has that moment with his mom where he's like, I cannot hide this stuff anymore. And he just
Hmm.
opens up to his mother, and it's this moment of honesty. And And you just feel that where it's like, okay, he's been imagining that the minute that this is revealed to the person who loves him most, they're going to run and they're going to hate me. And
And they don't.
they don't. And even
Hmm.
though yes, it's a mess, and yes, he's created all these, and there's these consequences he has to face,
Hmm.
but that's not the issue. The issue is that he feels he wouldn't be loved. And
Yeah.
that's the
And
lie he's been telling himself. And then when he finally does, and the honesty comes forward, then you can have authentic relationships and you see
yes,
that
it's
you're loved.
beautiful. I turned to this guy's wife and I said, "Hey, what do you think about this? What did it feel like for you to have him tell you the truth after all this time?" And she said, "Oh, it's amazing. I feel closer to him. I feel peaceful. I feel like I can trust him." They were sitting closer on the couch than they had ever sat before in the room. You could tell that there was more love between them and more peace between them. It was just beautiful. Just an example of what doing shadow work can produce.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. It's, I've in working with some young adults, with marriage and dating, we've talked about disclosure discussions where maybe there's something in our past that we need to share with someone who's considering marrying us, right? And so we have these disclosure discussions and how scary that can be and how much courage we
Mhm.
have to have them. And and they don't always have to be deep dark things, you know. They can just be something that, you know, something in our shadow that. And I
Mhm.
remember having a disclosure discussion with Emily once, and and it wasn't it, she wasn't upset at what I was disclosing. It was that she was upset that I hadn't disclosed it sooner. It
Mhm. Why didn't you tell
it
me
was, yeah,
before?
why didn't you trust that I would respond with love anyway?
Mhm.
So it wasn't about the issue. So often what's crippling us is this issue, and what we're missing out on is the intimacy and love from the person who will still love us.
Oftentimes, and I don't want to be a pessimist, but I have to just point out some people's truthful experience that sometimes when we do disclose things,
Yep. Sometimes a disclosure is a
it
deal
doesn't go
breaker.
well, and the
Yep.
person is really angry and upset, and it doesn't go like that.
So how bad of this is kind of what I say to that. And you can tell me as a therapist if this is really bad advice.
Mhm.
I'm not giving it as a therapist. I'm just as a human being.
Okay.
Like if someone doesn't love me, knowing all of me, do I really want them? I'm not saying I'm not saying that they should be okay with deviant or bad behavior or abusive behavior or accepting all of that. I'm just saying the best parts of me and the worst parts of me, if they don't want me, do I really want them?
Yeah, it could be, maybe when you disclose something really painful that you've hidden from somebody, they might need time to grieve and be angry and upset about it, and they may come around. But if you're really truly dealing with yourself, and
Yes.
over time you continue to deal with yourself and try to be more honest and true, and they can never accept, your past mistakes and the person you're becoming, then you might want to ask that question,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's really what I mean by that.
Yeah.
That's
So it becomes
exactly what I
kind
mean by
of
that.
let's say a little bit more about just kind of the consequence of not looking in the shadow, even though we're acknowledging that this is really challenging, deep work to do.
Yeah. Scary, heavy.
Mhm. Scary, heavy, it's difficult,
Yeah.
although rewarding once you dare to go there. And it does take a lot of courage and curiosity and compassion, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I talked about being divided inside. There's this is an idea of Dan Siegel, but he talks about how if we don't look inside and deal with certain things, we tend to be one of two things. And he talks about a river. Like on one side of the river, if we don't integrate parts of ourselves, we're in a lot of chaos. Some of us live in a lot of chaos because we haven't integrated parts of ourselves. So that's one bank of the river. And the other bank of the river is rigidity. Some people deal with unowned parts by just being really rigid and very tight and very, mechanized because they haven't
Orthodox.
integrated. And what we want to do is kind of find that middle of the river where we're
Hmm.
going with the flow of who we are and kind of flowing down that river, even when it's a little turbulent. that we're not clear over here in this chaos or clear over here in this rigidity. So you can kind of pay attention, man, is my life in a lot of chaos? How could I help that? Or am I really rigid? Maybe there's some unintegrated things that need to be looked at. So I think we should get positive here and talk about what are some of the really amazing benefits of doing shadow work. Because the reason we're talking about this is because we're trying to build a stronger sense of core self. And so it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to access that beautiful core self that we all are when there's parts of ourselves that aren't acknowledged or unintegrated. There's a lot more authenticity. We're experiencing authenticity more and a deep sense of self-acceptance. When we do that work, we start to realize we have more capability than we thought we had before to do hard things. And kind of like you were saying, your therapist, I went into that rabbit hole and I realized, wow, that wasn't so bad. And I can do that. And then the other thing we keep kind of touching into and mentioning is relationship benefits, intimacy and closeness and connection with other people that we can increase when we deal with these parts of ourselves. And so all of this leads to our ability to access feelings of inherent worth and uncover that core self.
So, do you mind if I turn this just religious for a minute?
Sure.
So this is something that's interesting to me. So you said there's chaos on one side of the river. Who was that? That
Dan
is it
Siegel.
Siegel? Siegel.
Uh-huh.
So you've got chaos on one side, and then you've got rigidity. And for religious purposes, I use the word orthodoxy, right? Really
Mm-hmm.
strict religious
Mm-hmm.
observance.
Mm-hmm.
And
In an
um,
anxious way.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
So in the history of the New Testament, I think we see Sadducees and Pharisees that had taken the law, the law of God, and had, in order to avoid chaos, had gone so far to the other side to rigidity, and they had created a hyper vigilance to what they saw was obedience to the law, that it became something it wasn't intended to be. And so often we might think that when Jesus came and he taught these things and he was making corrections to what the Sadducees and Pharisees had done to the law, that they were like outright sinful, like trying to break the law. When in reality, that's not what the Sadducees and Pharisees were trying to do. They had taken the law too far. And because of that, individuals had lost their identity and it was interesting that the first thing you mentioned was agency became
Mm-hmm.
a result of when we deal with the shadow self.
Mm-hmm.
So, so to me, the beautiful thing about what Jesus Christ taught, um, in correction to the Sadducees and the Pharisees, is that more tolerance is. I got to be careful how I say that. I'm not trying to say that it's tolerance of things that are not okay, but love and compassion led to more agency and identity in
Mm-hmm.
people. And
Yep.
I think that that is so crucial in our day. Um, in some communities or cultures that are typically more religious or more orthodox, I see a tendency for that Pharisaical approach. And this is something that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a leader, President Uchtdorf, who's a member of the Quorum of the 12, he has talked about the warning that in our day we are becoming very Pharisaical.
Mm-hmm.
He says that we would rival the days of the Pharisees in the New Testament. And
Wow.
again, I don't mean to be too specific about one religion over another, but in a religious community and dealing with the mental health of religious individuals, it might surprise some to realize that the gospel love of Jesus Christ actually provides more freedom and more agency than we
Mm-hmm.
realize. It doesn't result in restrictiveness.
Mm-hmm.
It results in more, and it doesn't result in chaos either. It's
Yeah,
that
right.
middle.
We're not saying,
We're
hey,
not
look
going
at
for
this stuff so you
chaos.
can now be in chaos and be okay with that.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Dan,
Jesus said,
nail on it.
The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? To kind of
Yes.
describe this. And I do think that there's something to be said about, if we find ourselves desperately clinging to orthodox rules and, kind of in a pharisaical sort of way, because we're really afraid of looking at parts of ourselves that are hard
Yes.
to look at or feel or experience. And we cling desperately to these in a fearful way, anxiously to these rigid rules and stuff. That can be one way to avoid doing shadow work.
Yeah,
But that
that's
doesn't
exactly
mean
right.
that you're just going to descend into chaos as soon as you go looking
Right.
at parts of yourself. You're not going to do that. It actually is the opposite.
Exactly.
You integrate these things in ways that can make intentional choice easier and better for you. But this is scary stuff for
Yeah, it's
really.
the same with differentiation in our relationships, right?
Yes,
It will
yes.
feel like you're creating distance. We've said this before in the podcast. It will feel like you're creating distance and you're running away from the relationship. But once you get to the healthy, established place, it actually
Creates more
enhances
connection.
that
It
relationship
creates
and
more
makes it
connection
better.
and more integration and more congruency and all of that.
Yeah,
This is so true. This is a good point to bring up for us Christians out there that,
right.
like to cling to that in a scared way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I think that's where perfectionism and scrupulosity can
Yes,
come in.
exactly. That
Is
ties us
you,
all back to first episode, right?
yep,
Yep.
that's right.
That's where it comes from.
We think we earn our value
Yes.
through religious observance.
Yes. And sometimes dealing with perfectionism and scrupulosity and even, OCD things are looking at these parts of ourselves that are unacknowledged and that we're
Right.
so scared to experience. Yeah. Okay, Eric, I think we should kind of wrap this up by talking about what do we need in order to do shadow work? Because, I think we've made it pretty clear that this isn't this isn't easy.
No.
Okay, so I thought it would be nice to talk about a few things that could help, a few ideas that can help people kind of get more comfortable with the idea of doing this. And the first one is just tapping into your patience and your compassion, your self-compassion. I always bring up self-compassion because you cannot do shadow work without self-compassion. We need to give compassion to those parts of ourselves that aren't so beneficial to our thriving. So you want to bring a lot of patience towards yourself and self-compassion when you start to do shadow work. You need that. The second thing is to know your why. Why am I doing this? And I hope we're making that clear that this is a really good thing to do to find that beautiful core self. I mean, you got to know, why am I popping the lid off on all this smelly stuff that I don't really want to look at?
Yeah. So, in other words, to be more intentional
Yes.
rather than just
Why would I want to do this,
passively
right? And
going
it's
through
to
things.
know that the house divided can't stand. And so if you're divided against yourself in some way, that's not going to be helpful and beneficial for you going forward.
Right.
The next one is to build a stronger sense of common humanity. And what I mean by that is this is the human condition to have shadow. There's not a single person out there who doesn't have shadow parts of themselves, because this is what it means to be human and to be part of the human condition. And when the shadow parts aren't known, we make ourselves the exception. And what I mean by that is that back to that one up and one down. Oh, I can't look at shadow self. I've got to always be better than others. Oh, shadow is drowning me. And even one down people aren't looking at shadow in a healthy way. They're doing it with so much shame, right? And so you have to occupy these distortions when you don't, like, you make yourself the exception. I'm worse than others or I'm better than others. And the truth is, we're all the same. We're all beautifully, equally valuable and precious. Let's see, one, two, three. The fourth one is to develop curiosity and then add curiosity and compassion together. Those are the key words for me. Those have become my keywords. Curiosity. Oh, Jill, why are you doing that? Let's compassionately look at that part of yourself and where that came from and why it's there and what it's doing. In therapeutic circles, this is called parts work. And it's really a cool modality for helping people understand these things. The other thing that shadow work can help you do is to figure out your strongest values and challenge yourself to live by them so that your behavior becomes congruent with who you're working to become. And your values are your anchor point. They're your guiding map for who you're becoming. And there's something really beautiful about tapping into that and really honing in on those values and working to become those things. And then my favorite reason, and this is why we're talking about all this, is that integrating the shadow will help you find a refuge right inside yourself so that being with yourself feels safe. And so you can be less reliant on those external sources of self that are very unstable at times and not really the best navigation and anchor point for a sense of self, but you can find that peaceful refuge right inside of you. And that's very anchoring. But it's hard to find that when there's a lot of unintegrated things. And what I want to say is I'm going to be shadow parts of myself are going to be revealed to me continuously throughout my lifespan. And how willing I am to kind of look at those things really determines a lot of the my well-being.
Yeah, it's so if I were to sum that up, it sounds like what we need to do is create is to realize that life is a laboratory
Hmm.
because laboratories, we're experimenting and sometimes the experiments fail and they blow up in our faces. But it doesn't mean that we're not learning things and gaining knowledge as we go through those things. So we give ourselves space and we give ourselves time and we give ourselves experiment
Hmm.
and experience.
Hmm.
And if we're sitting there thinking that every day is the test, and if we fail the test, it's all over,
Hmm.
well, then we're going to be panicking.
I mean, think about what if the quality scientists have to have in a laboratory? They've got to be curious and open to failed experiments and then try again, right?
Objective. Yep.
Yeah, so it's a good way to think about it, I think. I think it's helpful. Can we end with some resources if people want to go
Yeah.
a little deeper into
Yeah.
this? Okay,
You
the
bet.
first one, this is real deep. So this just depends on how intellectual you want to be about this and how much you want to read about this. There's a book called Meeting the Shadow: The Hidden Power of the Dark Side of Human Nature, which is just a compilation of a lot of different people smart people talking about this.
So it's not a
Um,
horror book. It's
it's not. But it's a lot. So I'm just warning. That
yeah.
comes with a warning
Okay.
because to look that way, this is compiled by Connie Zwig and Jeremiah Abrams, and so it's a big fat book, but it's pretty deep if you want to go really deep into this. If you like the neuroscience side of this, I want to recommend a book by Dan Siegel called Mind Sight. Mind Sight.
I've heard of
He
that
talks
book.
about the brain and the neuroscience of integration. It's really one of my favorites. The other one that I like that's more casual and kind of fun to listen to if you want to go light with this is a book called The Mountain Is You by Brianna Wiest. Have you heard of it?
I have. In fact, Emily's read that book.
It's really good. I
Yeah.
really like it. And another one that's real fun and just, Brene Brown is so good at looking at this, is The Gift of Imperfection.
Never heard of her. Kidding.
What planet are you on? But I really like that book, The Gift of Imperfection, and just kind of looking at like our imperfections are good in a way. And she puts a really beautiful spin on that. And then my other one that I really love, that's a favorite of mine, that has more like a Buddhist psychology kind of bent to it, is The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer.
I've heard you talk about that
And
one.
he has a lovely podcast too. And he kind of takes the mindfulness view of this.
Mhm.
So people who really like that contemplative side of this or the mindfulness side might really like to step into his work. So those are my, off the top of my head recommendations for people who want to go a little deeper into shadow work and looking at the self in that way.
Awesome. That's great.
Okay.
Well, that's been a great session, Jill. See, I'm calling them sessions now because I'm like the guinea pig patient here.
I know it's true. It feels like a therapy session in a
Therapist.
way, doesn't it? Yeah. So that was a great podcast. What do we even call this?
Yeah, it's a podcast.
Okay.
It's not a therapy session,
Episode,
but
episode.
that's right. Episode. That's right.
Episode. Okay, well, if you like this, we've got a third one coming, so stay tuned
Yep.
because I
Third
want to
one's
go
coming up.
more to the positive side and really focus on the positive side of your deeper self. I think people will really like the third episode in this series.
Yeah, so just in conclusion, we're still in the differentiation, and this is the next one will be on the third step
Differentiation and
of
then
sense of
dealing with
self.
that skill number one, which is that sense of, building that strong core sense of self. So we have one more. I mean, I told you this was a lot of material. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we're taking it in bites. So
Yeah.
that's great.
So I'll see you next time.
Okay, thanks, Jill.
Bye, everybody.